All right, like I said, we started this because I like this kind of topic. I like to take a look at who we are and as a culture, and to say how did we get there so that we can identify, sort of the foundations of that. And if you weren't here last week when we started, last week we actually talked about freedom, because the Christian understanding of freedom that the disciples learned from Jesus and have passed on is not the same idea as the secular understanding of freedom. And a lot of people in our culture have that secular understanding that freedom means I can do just whatever I want to do. That's not how they saw it. That's not what he taught. He taught you're now free to do things that you should do, free to do things that can make the world a better place. But it was never the idea that I just get to do whatever I want to do. A lot of those things that you will do will cost you, and a lot of those things will inhibit you in some way or restrict you in some way. And that's the wonderful thing about being a person made in God's image, is that you can do those things and you can make an impact on the culture. And remember last week we pulled the verse out of John's gospel also where Jesus said to those who were believing in him, it didn't mean they were his followers yet, that if you follow me and you continue in my teaching, he said, you will know the truth, and the truth will do what? Yeah, it'll set you free, because sometimes the truth is not as obvious as we think it is, and sometimes it's so much more powerful than we think that it will be. I like to tell the story of when I met my wife. And I fall in love, and I'm learning about love because I'd been a believer. I've been raised in a church, but really been a believer since my high school junior year, and so learning a whole lot. Hadn't figured everything out yet, but learning a whole lot and trying to grow. But here's what I realized, and what I wanted to do when I met her, I wanted to give up a part of who I was for her. And is that a part of love? Is that a part of something that's good about freedom? Yes, I was free to be able to do that. For instance, before I would just go do what I wanted to do. Like if all of a sudden the guys called and said, hey, let's go play basketball, grab my bag, I'm out the door. Now all of a sudden, as I'm going out the door, I notice there's someone standing over by the door, right? When we're married, I'm like, oh, that's right. And is it a sacrifice? Of course it's a sacrifice to give this up, but it's worth it. Because you recognize when you do it, you're actually giving up a part of what you might call your freedom for something that is better than if you just could do and go and do whatever you want to do. I like to participate in weddings. When I was young, I did a wedding, and there's these phrases that you say in weddings, traditional vows. You say something like, for better or, for richer or in sickness and in, And so I'm doing this wedding, and the people at the wedding knew the couple a lot better than I do. I'd only known them about a year, and especially the bride. And at one point, I have her repeating after me, and I come to the part in sickness and in health, for richer, and she gets to where she's repeating that part, and she chokes. And the whole place just erupted. I mean, really erupted. They're all laughing, almost falling down. She can't say the words, and because they knew her. And as I learned later, somebody said, oh yeah, her whole life, she'd said, I will never marry anyone who's not rich. I mean, that was just, one of her criteria. And I understand, and she did. The guy that she married was fairly wealthy and was only gaining more wealth. And as far as I know, they are still married and still together. But there's this giving up that you do in order to make it better. Now it moves into this next part of who we are, and that is the idea of ourself, our identity. And there's this crisis that we face a lot of times in life of, man, I don't know who I am. I'm trying to figure out who I am, and there's this search for yourself that you're going through. Here's the problem with searching for yourself as far as our culture is concerned. When you're young, you don't know who you are. Of course you don't. You're not old enough to know who you are except for where you came from, right? You know who your parents are. You know what your community is. You know of the values that you were taught. That's by design. It's supposed to be that way. It's supposed to work that way because we know from science, that our brains and our thinking doesn't develop until later. I heard, you hear the numbers 25, 26. I just heard a new number now. They've decided that may be true for girls, but boys don't fully develop till they're like 32. I don't know if that's true. My wife would say, yes, there's no doubt, that your thinking hasn't fully developed. And so you're in a system, and this is the way it's always supposed to be, where you're learning who you are from other people that you got life from, parents and family and community, and you're learning who you are because, let's face it, a 5-year-old may feel like they're somebody, but by the time they get to be 12, are they that person? No, there's change, because they're developing, they're moving forward. My family was that way with us. We were taught who we were taught what we valued. Yes, I was raised going to a church, but like I said, then there came a point in my life where it had to be my decision, and I had to say, this is who I am, and this is what I will follow, and that is a part of it also that you have to recognize. So have you ever heard this phrase from your mom? I will use my last name. Bradleys don't what? They don't do that. You ever heard that? Or Bradleys do this. Yes, of course. Because she was instilling into us a sense of who we are, where we came from, the identity that she wanted us to hold on to, building that into us. I tell people, I never remember ever having my parents threaten us or try to bribe us for good grades. But I do always remember that it was expected that we had a good life, we were taken care of, the opportunity was there, we had a good mind, we were smart enough, we should be able to do the work and perform well enough. And it was just an expectation that was always there, as well as a moral expectation in my family, absolutely. My dad, I've told you before, my dad was a doctor, so grew up in a little small town. And in this town, my dad he carried a wallet, but he carried no money almost. I mean, sometimes he'd have $1 or $2. He carried no credit cards until the latter part of his life because he didn't want to charge things. And so, but he did charge things because everywhere my dad went, people knew him. So any place he went into, he would buy things and he would say, just send the bill to and they'd send it to his office. Well, I could go in and do the same thing, just to let you know. Because my dad would send me, my older brother and my sister sometimes say, go pick this up and just have them charge it to me. And so they'd send it to his office. And so I learned, ooh, this could be a good deal, right? Because there's some great toy stores and some athletic stores. And, I can just go in and order and just send the bill to my dad. I never did that because I knew the penalty. I knew what it would cost me if I did, that was not the expectation. This was not like you can just do whatever you want to do. There was a certain amount of responsibility to it, and I knew that, once the bill arrived a week later, I would have to answer for it. So, but that's how I was raised. Here's what, if you go to anthropologists and those who study, here's what they say about cultures. Cultures do the same thing. Cultures have expectations. Communities have expectations of who you're supposed to be, what you're supposed to do, how you're supposed to act, what the morality is. And some of that shifts and changes, which makes it difficult. They say this. They say in the past, if you were to break from those expectations, you would be considered a rebel, or you might be considered, someone who intentionally is trying to cause trouble. And they say, they say the strangest thing has happened in our culture. Now, if you go against expectations, there's at least part of the culture will say you're a hero, and they will lift you up in some way as a hero. And they said that is a very strange thing with the development of communities, because it actually goes against the way a community is developed, because the expectations are there for a reason, for a purpose, that we understand I behave like this and I do this for the sake, not just my sake, but for the sake of the community. In fact, one of the things that's kind of unusual about our culture is we have shifted from this idea, because of our idea of freedom and all, to this idea that I want to be free to do whatever I feel. And my feelings become the highest and greatest good. There's a problem with that. Your feelings change. Feelings never stay the same. And if you just acted upon what you felt and said, that's who I am, then you'd be in a dilemma 5 years later or 10 years later or 15 years later, because your feelings would change. Does your identity change? Well, if you're building it on that, yes, your identity constantly changes and you're never sure of who you are. There needs to be, for human beings, there needs to be this sense of who we are. So that as the culture changes, the world changes, and we live in a world that's not always easy to deal with, we still understand where we came from, who we are, and what the values that we hold to, what those values are. That's what Jesus gave to his followers. That's what he built into them, where he taught them about who they were, where they came from, that they were created by God himself. Tony Evans, I was told this last week, so I went and listened to Tony Evans' sermon last week. Someone told me that he preached the same sermon that you did. I said, well, we talk all the time, and we do not. So I went back and listened to it, and he did talk about freedom last week, and he did say this. This was really interesting. He said in the early part of Genesis, here's what you find the word freedom mentioned for the very first time, when God puts Adam and Eve in the garden, and he says to Adam and Eve, he said, from the trees of the garden you may eat. What do you think the word was? You may eat freely. Yeah, eat freely. Were there restrictions in the garden? Absolutely there were restrictions in the garden. Not many, just one tree. Just don't eat of this tree. But there was an incredible freedom that he gave us so that we would choose, and so that we would learn how to choose and what to choose well with our lives. I think that that's a part of who we are, and a good part of who we are. I said I like to listen to history and reading history. So I went back and I was reading about a guy named Friedrich Nietzsche. I don't know if you know who that is. He's born in 1844, I think, and lived till about the 1900s. He's actually one of those his influence is considered still very heavy on Western society, but he's German. He had a lot of influence over Sigmund Freud and over the Nazi Party in their understanding of life. And here's what Nietzsche said. I put this quote in here because I thought that you would be interested in this quote. So Nietzsche is not a Christian. Nietzsche actually is against Christianity and all religion and pretty much almost all sources of authority in his day. Here's what Nietzsche said. He said, when one gives up the Christian faith, think about what he's saying. When one gives up the Christian faith, one pulls the right to Christian morality out from under one's feet. Right. Because the morality that you hold to has a foundation, a place that it comes from. And if you lose the foundation, he says, you don't have a right to that morality. You can't make it up yourself. And this is what our culture has tended to do, is take a morality that came from the Christian faith, pull Christianity out from under it, and say, but we're going to hold to those same values. And then now we find ourselves shifting in those values and losing those values. And Nietzsche is exactly right. Why? Because we pulled out the foundation of those values. And you won't be able to hold to them if you don't have that foundation. You lose where they came from. In one sense, you lose the identity of those values, So they don't really fit anymore. Just to let you know, Nietzsche, his influence and his ideas were that there should be no religion and there should be no oversight of any kind of Christianity or anything like that. I think John Lennon wrote a song like that too, right? Imagine there's no heaven. Okay, so yeah, he had influence. He did influence us. But this is what he also writes. He says that we should have no rights. People should have no rights. All rights should be taken away also, and then we would have the perfect society. That's kind of Lennon's song also. You think that would work? I don't think so either. Because it's not the absence of those things, it's actually the presence of those things and who gave us those things that actually keeps us solid and functioning and moving together. Nietzsche had this view of, his view was you have the animal kingdom, then you have humanity as we are right now, and we are sort of the bridge to what he called an overman. Now, I would call it maybe a superman, and he viewed us as a transition to this superman who had no rules, had nothing overseeing him, but also had no rights to anything, and that would make the perfect utopian society. And several hundred years ago, they became obsessed with how could we build the perfect utopian society, and then we had the Great World Wars, right, where everybody say, okay, this is a good place to take over, and that's where we lose a lot of those rights and a lot of those things that we wanted to hold to. Here's what Jesus said. In fact, I think that if you go a couple more chapters from chapter 8, and you go to chapter 10, Jesus is actually talking to them, his disciples, in a way that you're going to see a lot about identity in his talk and what he actually told them. Here's what Jesus said in chapter number 10. He says, I tell you the truth, anyone who sneaks over the wall of the sheepfold, that would be the sheep pen where the sheep are, he says, rather than going through the gate, must surely be a thief and a robber. So Jesus is saying, listen, there's a way it has to work. There's a process or an opening that makes someone legitimate, and if they don't come in the legitimate way, then you don't want to follow what they say, or you don't want to listen to that voice because it would cost you. He says, but the one who enters through the gate is the good shepherd of the sheep, or the shepherd of the sheep. The gatekeeper opens the gate for him, and the sheep, he says, recognize his voice, and they come to him. He calls his own sheep, catch this, by name, and he leads them out of the gate, the area where they're enclosed, to go into pastures. He says, after he has gathered his own flock, he walks ahead of them, and they follow him because they know his voice. They won't follow a stranger, he says. They will run from him because they do not know his voice. So Jesus is saying there's legitimate authority, there's legitimate idea of who will lead you, and there's illegitimate. Sheep are a strange thing, aren't they? In fact, for the most part, in their day, it would be like us. They were insulted to hear that they were being called sheep. They were. Because sheep are not very smart animals. I've never been around them for very long. I've just seen them, but I've heard a lot of people talk about them, and they're just not smart animals. I guess that's why they have a really thick, woolly coat, right, to protect them, because they get into trouble all the time. They get stuck with that coat in the thicket all the time. One guy who kept sheep, I read, he said, if you put good food and bad food in front of them, it's just, roll the dice to which one they're going to eat. You're thinking, why would you eat the bad food? But it's just, he says, who they are. They need to be led. They need to be cared for. They need to be taken care of. Is that offensive to you if someone were to call you a sheep or a flock? Yes, of course, because we think, wait a minute, I can make decisions for myself. I can take care of myself. But Jesus is actually using this illustration because they knew the illustration. They had sheep. They had shepherds who cared for the welfare of the sheep. And so he's using it because he's saying, you need to understand, you need to think about who has my best interest in mind. Who is the one that I can trust with my life? And Jesus is using himself as an example of the shepherd that cares for his sheep. When I was a young pastor, there was a guy that I worked with who, he pretty much wanted my job. He wanted to take me out of my job. He wanted to take my job. So we had some struggles. And so he went to the church, and he told people in the church that I consider them dumb sheep, because we had been talking about leadership, and we were reading some of these passages, and I considered them dumb sheep. Well, is that offensive? Yeah, that would be offensive. That wasn't what we were talking about. What we're talking about is leadership. Who are you going to trust to lead you? Where are you going to find what you need to be led well? And what Jesus says might sound offensive, but it's not offensive at all. It's that Jesus knows more than we know. In fact, when Jesus addresses our identity, you know what he does with God? He says, he is God, but here's what you should refer to God as. You should refer to God as what? Father. right? Here, teaching them to pray. Here's how you pray. Our Father who is in heaven. It's a different relationship because a father, you get who you are from your mother and your father, your parents. Your DNA comes from them. Your abilities come from them. Your sense of morality, right or wrong, yes, it comes from them. Your training and your teaching comes from them because they have taken on the responsibility of caring for you and for raising you. And that's how he taught us to listen to God and to look to God. It's actually true in the Old Testament also because David, if you remember the 23rd Psalm, David says about God, he said that he is the great shepherd. I put my hope and my trust in him. And then he adds, and because of that, I shall not want. He means for direction, to know where to go and to do the things that he should do, because that's how God should be viewed. He is the one that you and I can trust to lead us and to guide us. Then he adds this, or this is what it says about the story in the next verse. Those who heard Jesus use this illustration, they did not understand what he meant. Yeah, because it was offensive to them also, so they're struggling with it. So he explained it to them. He said, I tell you the truth, I am the gate for the sheep. So the first identifier for Jesus is, he's actually the opening to go through. If you don't go through Jesus, it's because, it's not someone who cares for the sheep. He says, all who came before me were thieves and robbers, but the true sheep did not listen to them. Yes, I am the gate. Those who come in through me will be saved. They will come and go freely, and they will find good pastures. The thief's purpose is to steal and kill and destroy. My purpose is to give them say this with me, a what? A rich and a satisfying life. Yeah, that's what Jesus intends to do with us, is to lead us to the life that is good for us, that there's a satisfaction to this life. We understand who we are. We know the opportunities that we've been given, and as we follow him and we trust him, we'll end up in a place that we're glad that we have followed him. Then he adds this. He sort of gives another idea of this same illustration. He says in verse 11, I am the good shepherd. So, and he's going to clarify the difference in a good shepherd and a shepherd that is only hired, and only does the job because he gets paid for it. He says a good shepherd, catch this, sacrifices his life for his sheep. Wow. I mean, it's a pretty powerful image for them, because they knew the story of David. And if you know the story of David, when David was a young boy, youngest of his family, David was a shepherd. His job was to go out and to keep the sheep. And in the midst of danger, when danger came, David actually talks about he didn't run from the danger. He actually stood and he defended the sheep from the danger. Why? Because the sheep belonged to him. They actually belonged to his father. He cared for them. It was personal for him. So when the wolf came or the bear came, whatever, David would stand against the enemy of the sheep. This is who Jesus is for us also. In verse number 12, he says, a hired hand will run when he sees a wolf coming. He will abandon the sheep because they don't belong to him, and he isn't their shepherd. And so the wolf attacks them and scatters the flock. The hired hand runs away because he's working only for the money, and he doesn't really care about the sheep. But Jesus says in verse 14, but I am the good shepherd. I know my own sheep. They know me, just as my Father knows me, and I know the Father. So I sacrifice my life for the sheep. I have other sheep too that are not in this sheepfold, this sheep pen. He says, I must bring them also. They will listen to my voice, and there will be one flock with one shepherd. This is Jesus referring to the Gentiles who would later also be brought in from a different sheepfold, but they would become a part of the flock, one shepherd, one group of sheep also as they are brought in. Then he says in verse 17, the Father loves me because I sacrifice my life so I may take it back again. Catch this. No one can take my life from me. I sacrifice it what? voluntarily. That means Jesus does this freely. He gives up himself. He sacrifices himself freely. That's what freedom is. Why? Because it's a good thing to do. It's worth it. He loves the sheep, so he's going to give his life for the sheep because that's how much he cares for the sheep. When my dad, at one point, he needed a tax write-off. So you know how that game is played. And so the accountants tell him, you need to buy some land. You need to put, at first we thought he was going to put horses on it. Everybody happy about that? Oh, man. I rode horses. I loved riding. We're going to have our own horses. A pretty big piece of land. Had a pond on it. Boy, this is going to be great. Until my dad found out horses are a lot of work. And he was like, no, because y'all aren't going to do it. As a kid, you won't keep up with all the work. I'll have to do the work. And so he was like, we're not doing that. We're going to get cows instead. That's what the accountant told him. Cows are a lot easier. Get cows. So my dad came to us and says, y'all can ride cows. Well, I've seen that in a rodeo. You don't want to ride a cow. It's a very dangerous thing to do. They don't really like being ridden. And then what I found out was this is before Angus beef became a big thing. My dad bought black Angus because they went to some people who dealt with cattle, and they said, if you're going to do cows, you don't want to do a lot of work, you want to go with black Angus. They're not as big, not as much beef, but they're the easiest cows to take care of them. They're really low in diseases and struggles. They calve without any assistance, and he says, you don't want to get into that if you can help it. And so we bought black Angus cattle, and now my dad probably wishes he was still here and still had them because they're very expensive now, and they're considered a better beef. But one of the problems with buying cattle and the kids, us taking care of the cattle, guess what we did? We named every cow, right? We knew them all by name, and every time there was a calf born, we named every calf because they were like pets to us. I mean, that's how much we cared for them. It wasn't just something that we would, go out there and do a job. It became personal. Yeah, that's the way it is with God. God knows every person. He names every person. They belong to him. He cares for them. So when there's danger or there's a threat to them, guess who will stand up and offer their life in sacrificing for his kids? Yeah, the Father will. He will stand up and do that. And so Jesus describes himself as that kind of shepherd who names and he cares for and he offers himself for those that he loves. He says, for I have authority to lay it down when I want to and also to take it up again. For this is what my Father has commanded. This is the place that the Father has called Jesus to act and to stand. It says, when he said these things, the people were again, I like this, the people were again divided. You know what that meant? Some believed him, some liked it, some said, nope, don't like what he's talking about, don't like the idea, have my own ideas, I'm going to work by a different idea. And like that's just the reality of life. So they're divided in their opinions about him. Some said, he is demon-possessed and out of his mind. Whenever you don't agree with someone, and this is especially true in the political season, right? You don't just say, hey, I don't agree with that person's political stance or with their views. No, what do you say? He's a demon, right? Yeah, he's out of his mind. He's on some kind of drugs, right? Because that tends to justify in your mind your view. They did the same thing. He's demon possessed. We don't know who he is. We don't understand what in the world's going on with him. I mean, you don't want to follow him because it's a way of saying if you were to follow after him and believing, you've lost your mind also. And so they tried to label Jesus in exactly the same way. And this is what it says. It says, why listen to a man like that? But others said, this doesn't sound like a man possessed like a demon. Can a demon open the eyes of the who? Now, the reason this is important is because the chapter before, if you want to go back and read chapter 9 in John, chapter 9 in John, Jesus encounters this man who's been blind his whole life. From birth, he's never been able to see. And Jesus actually is the famous story where he goes and he spits in the dust, and you think, ooh, but he makes mud out of it. He coats the man's eyes in the mud. He tells him, go to the pool in Siloam and wash the mud off. And the man did, and he comes back, and guess what? Is he blind anymore? No, he can see. And of course, it creates a great stir among the people, because here's a man who can give sight to the blind. Never been able to see, he gives the man sight. It also creates a great stir with the Pharisees, the religious leaders, those who view they are in control of the society, because he's changing everything. He's changing how they see things. He's changing who they listen to. And so what do? Well, he's demon possessed. He's a bad man. In fact, they bring the man to themselves, the religious leaders, and some say, he just looks like the man. That's not the same guy. The guy that was blind is a different guy, but they bring him, and the guy actually says, no, that was me, yeah. And they said, who is he? How did this happen? He says, I don't know. They bring his parents, and they say, your son, because they can put a lot more pressure on the parents, and it says that the parents felt that pressure, don't want to be cast out by their culture, by their group. And they, in order to kind of deflect, they say, well, he's of age, ask him what happened, don't ask us. Okay, it's a pretty good move, because they go back to him again, and they say, so what happened? He said, okay, listen, here's what happened. I was blind, now what? Yeah, okay, pretty simple, right? I couldn't see, I was blind, now I see. And they're like, but how could that happen? And I like it, because he actually says, so are you guys kind of trying to examine it and figure it out because you want to be his followers too? Well, they blow up over that, Be his followers, what are you talking about, And they want to cast him out also, because he goes against what they believed, how they wanted life to be. Maybe you could say how they felt life should be. It's a different authority, but the good thing about this authority is this is someone who proves by his life that he can do what he says, that the claims that he makes, he backs those claims up. The promises that he can give, he can back up those promises. It's a whole different understanding of life. And if you're going to build your identity on someone and on something, wouldn't you want to build it on the one who could do these things rather than the one who would fight against these things? Yes, of course. And they saw this shift going on. And the people drawn, not because Jesus gave them what they wanted or he was throwing gifts at them. It was just because of his ability to do things that they couldn't do. And it reflected who Jesus was, where he came from, the authority of the Father that he told them, it's your Father, I came to do these things for that reason. This week I decided, just for some reason, to read the little short called The Ugly Duckling. You remember The Ugly Duckling, the short? Most of us, I don't know that I ever read it before, but you've heard the story, or at least, a short version of it, but it was written by Hans Christian Andersen. In fact, he published it the same year that Friedrich Nietzsche was born. No, nothing there. It was just a kind of a strange thing that's when he published it. And if you know the story, it starts out kind of strange. It just starts out in the nest. There's a hen, there's a duck, and she has her eggs. And for some reason, there's another egg, and it's different. It's just kind of a strange egg. One of the other hens comes in the story and says, that's a turkey egg. I've seen this before. I don't know what that means. Maybe turkeys lay eggs in ducks' nests. I don't know. But she says, you don't want to have anything to do with it. Just abandon it. Hadn't hatched yet. The others have hatched. I'm just telling you, it's a turkey egg. And when it hatches, the little chick won't swim. It won't do, it's just a disaster. It won't do anything you want them to do. So she decides to hatch the egg anyway. And sure enough, the chick that comes out looks different. It's bigger, it's uglier, but it ends up that it swims really well. It jumps in with the other ducklings and swims well and goes to the bottom and hunts and does all the things it's supposed to. But eventually they batter the little chick. The other ducks peck at it and they drive the chick off. At one point in this short story, the chick finds this house with a door that's dilapidated, and the bottom there's a little opening, and goes into a house and kind of finds a new home, a new family of an old woman, a cat It sounds dangerous to me, but a cat that could purr and could arch its back, and another hen that was there that would lay eggs. And I thought, okay, well, at least, here I've kind of found a home, except the pressure was on. Can you arch your back and purr from the cat? No. Can you lay eggs? No, it was a male and could not lay eggs, so eventually gets kicked out again. Goes into the winter, almost freezes to death, according to the story, and eventually ends up at a place where this ugly duckling sees these beautiful swans, just these gorgeous, huge, graceful, just, sort of the ultimate of birds in the water, and sees them, yearns, why couldn't I have been something like that? And at some point, the little ugly duckling decides life's not worth living. And so I will go and I will approach the swans, as beautiful and as powerful as they are, and they will kill me. That's the story, actually, that I will go do this. And so as the ugly duckling goes into the water and swims out to the swans and lowers its head before them to be killed, he sees his reflection in the water. And of course, the ugly duckling is not a duckling. He's a what? He's a swan, yeah. And he's taken back by it. And so this place where these swans are is often visited by a family and some kids. And this is how the story ends, the short story ends. It says, into the garden presently came some little children, and they threw bread and cake into the water. See, cried the youngest, there's a new one. And the rest were delighted and ran to their father and mother, dancing and clapping their hands and shouting joyously, there's another swan come. A new one has arrived. Then they threw more bread and cake into the water and said, the new one is the most beautiful of all. He is so young and pretty. I don't know about the pretty part for young boys, but anyway, so young and pretty. And the old swans, listen to this, they bowed their heads before him. Then I love this last paragraph of his story. He says, then he felt quite ashamed, and he hid his head under his wing, for he did not know what to do. He was so happy, and yet not at all proud. He had been persecuted and despised for his ugliness, and now he heard them say he was the most beautiful of all birds. Even the elder tree bent down its bough into the waters before him, and the sun shone warm and bright. Then he rustled his feathers, he curved his slender neck, and he cried joyfully from the depths of his heart. I never dreamed of such happiness as this when I was an what? Ugly duckling. Yeah. It's a wonderful story, Danish author, Christian background, the idea that God rescues and he redeems. And so many times as we go through our life, we look at our life based on the culture around us and how the culture reacts to us, and we just feel out of place. We don't think we belong. We feel like we're, ugly or unwanted. And then all of a sudden, what you find is God had a different intention for your life, which is why Jesus Christ came, to show us who we really were supposed to be, where we should learn about who we are from. And everything changes. And it's not a kind of change that puffs you up, makes you proud or arrogant. It's the opposite. It humbles you. It brings tears inside, but they're actually tears of great joy and happiness, because now you've found who you really are, who you're really created to be. Let's pray together. And this morning, as we're praying, if you're here and maybe you've never thought about who God made you to be, God's plans for you, and He had plans for you. Maybe because you've grown up in a world where maybe you felt like the ugly duckling, or maybe you felt like you couldn't find your place to belong, or maybe you weren't raised with the same love that you felt like you should have been raised with and care. Jesus showed us there is a Father who loves us and cares for us. And He proves it by sending His Son to rescue us. Even the man who was born blind, he found something that he had never found around him before. That there was a God who cared for him, who loved him, had plans for him. They weren't bad plans. They were good plans. But they were good plans that actually help humble us, make us realize just how loved and cared for we really are. That there's a place for us, a place for our lives, as we find that we belong to him and we are his. We find out what our true identity is. If you've never opened your heart to seeing yourself through the eyes of God's Son, the one who would lay down his life for you, I encourage you this morning. He is alive. He is real. He is still moving and changing the lives of people. Not everyone will choose this, but what an opportunity for you to say, Lord Jesus, thank you for giving your life for me. Thank you for coming, being like me, to show me what life is really all about. Suffering and struggling through life, the same struggles that I go through. But through them all, I thank you that you knew who you were, you held to who you were, and to what the Father had called you to do so that I could be set free. Lord Jesus, come live inside of me. Forgive me my sins. Lead me into the life that you have for me, that you planned for me. In Jesus' name I pray.